So the Political Party Funding Act is set to be finalised soon by the National Assembly. Now, the bill will restrict the amount of donations a party can receive from outside donors during campaigns. In its current form, the president is the only one who can make regulations concerning the limits and donations. But let's get some analysis on what the passing of the bill will entail. And for that, we're joined by election expert Michael Atkins. He joins us now for more. Michael, a good morning to you. And thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. I think, firstly, before we talk about this, let's talk about the timing, right? If this is happening at the right time and really the sort of changes that could possibly happen. Now, let's start with really the powers of the president where funding is concerned, if we're moving in the right direction. Should we start there?
Well, yes, thank you. The timing is related to the fact that those amendments are part of an electoral matters amendment bill, which the president will need to sign before the election. So the changes to the Political Party Funding Act, some of them were sort of not strictly needed at this point, but they were included. Now, the motion in Parliament is actually to fix a small hole in the amendments, which accidentally led to there being no limits. So the Parliament is scheduling a resolution which would then enable the president to pass regulations at the same time as he signs the Electoral Matters Amendment Bill into law. So in a sense, the timing is accidental. We will see indications are that the president will not change the donations limits and the reporting threshold at this stage. So in some sense, it's a necessary step happening now, but it doesn't hold great significance in its own right at the moment.
Yeah, especially when we are just weeks before the election. And of course, the focus would be on how much political party funding is given during campaigning, right? And I think that's quite interesting, particularly when you start to look at some of the declarations that political parties already have made. But what do you make of where we sit right now with some of the thresholds, right? That parties must declare donations greater than 100,000 Rand. That's been understood for a very long time. But that they may not receive more than 15 million Rand from a single donor per year. That one particularly concerning if you look at some political parties.
Well, the limits were agreed when the original Funding Act was passed in 2018, and there certainly may have been scope for adjustments in relation to inflation over the period. What remains to be seen is whether the president will make any major changes. Part of the problem that was raised by several submissions was that the president would be able to make his own decisions as to what those limits should be. So we will wait and see whether it stays the same for now or whether there is a major change to those limits. And there's no cap on what the limits could be raised to.
Yeah, and just speaking of the various political parties, I know that in December, towards the end of last year, you had political parties also declaring to the IEC some of the funding that they'd received. The ruling party declaring 700,000 Rand, the Democratic Alliance declaring 36 million Rand that had been received in not just one bulk payment, but over various payments. So Ms. M. Slack, who donated 15 million Rand to the Democratic Alliance and then a 10 million Rand. So let's talk a little bit about how political parties are able to work around some of this legislation. You know,
there certainly is a variety of donors, and people will tend to, in a sense, try and poke holes in what other political parties are doing. But one of the biggest issues, although the Funding Act makes provision for donations in kind, to my mind, that is one of the biggest loopholes in the Act, because there's very little way of controlling. Let's say a party has a stadium event as to who pays for the event.
Right.
You know, parties must declare the donations they get, and the IEC is reliant on the party's honesty with those declarations. Now, almost certainly parties are declaring the actual funds deposited into their account. But there are some big questions about the spending of parties and whether those are being paid by third parties without a declaration being made.
I wonder if there's a disadvantage at all in declaring, particularly when you have smaller parties like, for instance, the Freedom Front Plus or the IFP, that then would declare, 112,000 Rand for the IFP, 131,000 Rand for the Freedom Front Plus. And if it in any way that may, in your view, sway even the electorate, right, even the viewer to say, and the voter to say, well, these parties don't really have much and they're not able to garner donations. So do they deserve a vote? Am I making too far of a connection there?
Look, it's very difficult to tell how much that would affect people's perceptions. Certainly in politics, one does have this, if I can call it, the strongman mindset that people that appear successful will tend to attract support because of the perceptions. But it's very difficult to know, except for the large amounts, how much attention ordinary voters pay to the details of those particular declarations.
Yeah, so then when you speak about some of those loopholes where you see political parties, for instance, saying, well, a donor may not deposit the money directly into the party's account, but may certainly assist in organizing a rally or a stadium event. Is there a way that we can write into the legislation so we can get transparency on that?
Look, it's a tricky area. The law relies on parties declaring those areas of assistance. The only other way, because parties can't tell their competitors during a campaign, this is how much I'm spending, but there might potentially be a confidential register of election campaign spending. That would be one route. It would be tricky and the details would be interesting, but that would be one route to sort of close the loop, as it were, to ensure that the funding declarations were honest.
Yeah, okay. And just as we wrap up, I mean, we've got some contention around just the constitutionality of the bill as it sits at the moment, right? You've got the Democratic Alliance saying that the bill is still a bill, it's not an act. You've got others that are essentially saying the DA Chief Whip, Siviwe Gwagube, agreed, said that they need to get some clarity on the status of the bill. Should this not have been sorted out by now?
You see, the funding... The controversial changes to the funding legislation should not really have been included in a general amendment bill that just tidied up details before an election. It should have been a separate process and considered more fully. So I think there's a lot of distress among several of the parties that a rushed bill that should have been non-controversial included some of these big changes. And the possibility looms for those limits to be changed to anything. Whereas the Constitutional Court said in 2018 that the public has the right to have information, reasonable access to information about private funding of political parties. If there's a massive reporting threshold, we will simply never know. So there are definitely some constitutional concerns. In the short term, it would be unusual to expect that there would be any major changes to those limits. But certainly this is something the next parliament should be looking at.
Yeah, and then where does the bill then place the likes of independent candidates that now are entering the political frame?
Well, this is an interesting question because, strictly speaking, the non-controversial elements of the bill, which includes bringing independent candidates into the reporting system, should have been passed before the election period commenced.
Right.
So independent candidates are currently not required to report on their donations. Now, obviously, certain candidates are being very open about their spending, others are not. And it is actually a loophole, not a loophole, it's a gap that we've gone through almost an entire election campaign and there has been no law in place regulating the reporting of donations to independent candidates.
All right, we're going to leave it there, Michael. Thank you so much for speaking to us and really trying to give us some insight into this quite a technical discussion, but I think an important one for the electorate as we walk towards the elections and see how political parties are resourcing themselves as they try to woo you for your vote. Michael Atkins, of course, is an independent consultant and an election result analyst.